Could we take the lights down right away, please? Great. And may we have the first slide on the left. Thank you for your generous words. Turn this a bit. So I want to begin by considering a well-known picture by the contemporary Vancouver-based photographer Jeff Wall, the full title of which is Adrian Walker, Artist, Drawing from a Specimen in a Laboratory in the Department of Anatomy at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, and it's made in 1992. Technically, it's a large cyberchrome transparency mounted on a light box, which is to say illuminated from behind by fluorescent lights, and that is, of course, Wall's preferred medium. In my opinion, and by common consensus, and I am quite sure that this is a large reason why you're here tonight, Jeff Wall is one of the most ambitious and accomplished photographers working today. But of course, to say this is to say something quite different from what a comparable claim would have entailed even 20 years ago. One of the most important developments in the so-called visual arts of the past 20-plus years has been the emergence of large-scale, tableau-sized photographs that by virtue of their size demand to be hung on gallery walls in the manner of easel paintings, and in other respects as well aspire to what might loosely be called the rhetorical or beholder addressing significance of paintings, while at the same time declaring their artifactual identity as photographs. This is a topic that goes beyond the scope of my talk this evening, though it will also be covered in the two talks to come on Struth and the Beckers. The point I want to stress, however, is that Wall has been a central figure in that development, and that Adrian Walker is a striking example of such a work. Now, one way of categorizing Adrian Walker with respect to its subject matter is in terms of what has come to be known as genre painting. But the issues with which it engages go far beyond those of genre as such. Now, here's a brief excerpt from an interview with Wall by Martin Schwander. It's an interview that took place in 1994. Schwander, to Jeff Wall, with Adrian Walker, you made a portrait of a young man who is concentrating so intensely on his work that he seems to be removed to another sphere of life. Wall. But I don't think it's necessarily clear that Adrian Walker is a portrait. I think there's a fusion of a couple of possible ways of looking at the picture generically. One is that it is a picture of someone engaged in his occupation and not paying any attention to or responding to the fact that he is being observed by the spectator. In Michael Fried's interesting book about absorption and theatricality in late 18th century painting, he talks about the different relationships between figures in pictures and their spectators. He identified an absorptive mode, exemplified by painters like Chardin, in which figures are immersed in their own world and activities and display no awareness of the construct of the picture or the necessary presence of the viewer. Obviously, the theatrical mode was just the opposite. In absorptive pictures, we are looking at figures who appear not to be acting out their world, only being in it. Both, of course, are modes of performance. I think Adrian Walker is absorptive. For the record, Wall and I met by chance in the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam in 1996, which is also where and when I saw Adrian Walker for the first time. It quickly emerged that we had been tracking each other's work for years, and since then we've become friends. May I have the next slide on the right, please? 3 genre paintings by the great Jean-Baptiste Siméon Chardin, the artist mentioned by Wall in the quotation that I've just read, make relevant viewing for us. The first is the young student drawing, made sometime between 1733 and 38, we think, from the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth. Although Wall's Adrian Walker depicts the draftsman largely in profile rather than from behind, we nevertheless feel we are looking somewhat over his shoulder. We are slightly behind him, in other words. And of course, we are shown the drawing he is making in soft reddish lead, just as in the Chardin. May I have the second slide on the right, please? The next slide on the right. The second work, The Young Draftsman from 1737 in the New Gemälde Gallery in Berlin, subtly directs the viewer's attention to the chalk holder in the hands of the young artist. Just as in Adrian Walker, we are given a clear view of the mechanical pencil in the protagonist's right hand. I'll also just alert you to the pinkish string that hangs this side of the table. In fact, could we go back one image just for a second? And I want to just call your attention to the tear in the back of the jacket of the seated draftsman with that red undergarment showing through. I'll be alluding to that in a moment. So now we can go ahead one and then one more, please. And one more. Thank you. And here is a truly superb painting, if slightly mistitled, the so-called House of Cards, Chateau des Cartes, of around 1737 in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. I discuss this painting in some detail in Absorption and Theatricality, where I call attention to the telling juxtaposition of the two playing cards in the partly open drawer in the near foreground. I propose in that book that the face card that you see, apparently a Jack of Hearts, emblematizes the fact that the picture surface itself faces the beholder. That is, it's entirely open to our gaze. Whereas the dazzlingly blank back of the second card evokes the turned away, the sealed-off consciousness of the young man absorbed in his apparently trivial pastime. The juxtaposition of the two cards thus offers a kind of condensed statement of the structural duality of the painting as a whole, at once facing the beholder as artifact and closed to him or her as representation. I suggest, too, that paintings like the House of Cards, or, for example, the picture I won't show you, but the National Gallery of Art's Soap Bubbles of 1735 to 1740, I'm sure you're familiar with his Soap Bubbles pictures, represent a quietly momentous discovery on Chardin's part, namely that absorption as such is perfectly indifferent to the extra-absorptive status of its objects or occasions, so that particular actions, playing with cards or blowing bubbles, that in the previous century, Pascal, for example, would have stigmatized as mere distractions from the thought of a Christian life, emerge instead as the vehicle of a new, essentially positive psychological state, the ultimate implications of which, for a history of what might be called secular spirituality, or to use a Hegelian term, mindedness, we have yet to fathom. And I go on to argue, not just in Absorption and Theatricality, but in the two books that followed, Courbet's Realism and Manet's Modernism, that a central current or tradition in French painting, from Jean-Baptiste Greuze's momentous Salon debut in 1755, to the advent of Manet and his generation around 1860, can be understood in terms of an ongoing effort to make paintings that by one strategy or another appear, in the first place by depicting personages wholly absorbed in what they are doing, thinking, and feeling, and in multi-figure paintings by binding those figures together in a single unified composition, paintings that appear to deny the presence before them of the beholder, or to put this more affirmatively, to establish the ontological fiction that the beholder does not exist. Only if this was accomplished could the actual beholder be stopped and held before the canvas. Conversely, the least sense on the beholder's part that the depicted personages were acting or indeed posing for him, for her, was registered as theatrical, théâtral, in the pejorative sense of the term, and the painting was judged a failure. May I have the next slide on the right, please?